Our first panel of the day explores the transformation of our cities. This couldn't be better demonstrated than by Shoreditch, the place that we find ourselves in right now. And I'm pleased to welcome the panel to the stage. I will leave you in the capable hands of the author and host of the panel, Lillian Ogbogoh.
Good morning, all. First, I'd like to apologize that I sound like this. This is the joy of living in London and going on the tubes. People have germs. When I was asked to come on the panel this morning and join, we have Annie Menter, Dr. Andrew Harris, and Cllr Guy Nicholson. And we were looking at the shifts in London and looking at the fact that is London becoming too gentrified? Is London becoming too expensive for the creative class? And we have this amazing panel to discuss this. So,
Morning.
So, we're going to have to use a mic so that we can be heard. And also, if anybody has any questions, please raise your hands and we'll get to you. So, I'm going to start with Annie Menter, the co-founder of Arts and Society. Morning, Annie.
Good morning. I am very recently the co-founder of Arts and Society, but previous to that, I was director of the WOMAD Festivals organisation and more specifically artistic director of the WOMAD Foundation, which is the educational arm of the WOMAD Festivals. Right. So for the last 20 odd years I've been working with artists from around the world, bringing artists into this country, taking artists abroad and setting up projects which have cultural exchange at their heart, really. Right. I think for me the important thing is for there to be continuing creative migration, which is what I think this panel's about, between cities and communities. They have to value the inherent creativity in those places in the first place. It has to be valued by the people who live there and work there. Creativity needs a fertile and a rich ground to be able to propagate. And for those involved, they have to be open to new ideas, they have to be open to fresh approaches, and most importantly, I think they have to be open to taking risks.
Okay.
I think risk-taking is a big part of creativity.
Right. So, but my question is, with the continued gentrification, with the continued growth of the city in the manner that is going, where it's becoming more and more expensive to live and work in the city, are we in danger of losing the creative class that we have here?
Well, we will lose some of the creative class because without money, without the economy supporting creativity right across the board, not just the higher echelons, things will fall apart, they'll fall away. And I think that's evident. I come from Bristol, so I'm not a London person. I mean, I came from London originally, but for me, my experience is being based in Bristol, but working in London, working around the world. Right. So there are cities like Singapore where I've worked a lot, who have incredibly thriving creative communities because money is being invested in those communities on all levels. And I think that's the important thing. Gentrification is one thing, but it shouldn't push out the inherent creativity that's in all our cities.
Thank you so much. And that's a great answer because that gives a perfect segue to speak to our counselor and say what is happening with the investment into the city, into the art, into our creative element.
Yeah, thank you, Lillian. Good morning, everybody. And I'm, as Lillian has said, is a councillor in the London Borough of Hackney, and I'm a cabinet member in an elected mayor's cabinet for Regeneration. I've been a councillor since 1998, which I know that many people perhaps think is far too long. It's time for me to move on, but I haven't yet moved on, and I'm still here. But over that period of time, as you can probably imagine, some quite profound changes have taken place, whether it be in Shoreditch or whether it be across Hackney, and indeed elsewhere in East London too. And those changes bring with them some significant opportunities. They also bring with them some extraordinary challenges, one of which, Lillian, I think you sort of touched upon. Often it's referred to as gentrification, but the common thread that runs through this change is the rising of values, the cost of living, the cost of space, places to live in, places to work in. And this is a great, great challenge for us because it can become an incredibly divisive aspect of a dynamic within a community. It can separate and fracture communities rather than bring communities together. You can find that, and unfortunately, often in our lives, one looks across a neighborhood and can see one community who just, the default position is to feel excluded from this change, that it is something very alien, it is not part of perhaps their world. What I'd just like to do, if I may, is just show a film, very short film, so don't worry, it's not long, it's not boring. Basically what it does is it presents to you Hackney as it is today. And it is perhaps worth just having a look at that, and then, if I may, Lillian, just have a few minutes after the film, just to sort of expand on what it is that we're going to see.
Okay.
As I stressed, the film is very, very short, and I think I just have to ask the gentleman at the back to push the button.
Yeah, we can have that. We can see that for a couple of seconds. Yes.
The purpose of just showing that was to try to describe sort of where it is that Hackney has perhaps arrived at today. What it didn't, of course, show was the lives of 20,000 people who are not in work, who are living in Hackney. What it doesn't show is the 10,000 people who are perhaps some of the most vulnerable adults, not just in Hackney, but in London and in the UK. And neither does it show some of the great levels of child poverty that still exist within these communities in Hackney, around Shoreditch and Dalston, Hackney Central, Hackney Wick, the list goes on. What I would just perhaps sort of finish off by saying is that there is every opportunity for a profound social schism to emerge. Forget about affordability just for one moment, and about whether or not it's artists or creative designers, individuals working at the front of innovation and enterprise and entrepreneurship. Put that aside just for one moment. There is a great challenge in terms of just being able to provide enough decent homes at an affordable level. But all of these things are interrelated, because actually, the approach that I personally have taken and our political administration has taken is that all of that change and all of that excitement, that buzz, that energy that we just saw in the movie is indeed the very, very mechanism that you need to tackle those who are the most vulnerable in our communities and to support them to a better life and also to connect communities. There is as much opportunity for the wider community in Hackney, economic opportunity, to find a job, to create a living, a career, in what it is that we've just seen, as there is in any other sector of our economy. And increasingly, the creative economy has a dynamic within it. And in Hackney, we're seeing this dynamic quite literally blossom. And that dynamic is multi-sectors. It's not just about the visual artists. It is as much about the visual artist as it is about the applied artist, about the product designer. It is about those working within the media sectors, the digital media sectors, as it is those working in a studio, those creating objects as well as those creating tech. Creative tech is a very, very important ingredient in today's economy and our future economy. And the challenge and the task of a council must be to connect communities to these extraordinary opportunities and this incredible energy that we're seeing take place in some of the hearts of our cities, and Shoreditch is one of those places. And that is the task that we're doing, and perhaps over the course of the coming conversation, we can expand on that a little bit more.
We will touch on some of the points you made. So we're going to go to Dr. Andrew Harris, the co-director of UCL Urban Lab. Hi. We're going to ask you a question. Is there enough room for the creative community to actually thrive in London?
Yes, I mean, I think there's more space in London than people realise. I think often there is a narrative of somehow, I mean, particularly, I guess, understandably with the demographic growth that London's experiencing, I think the population is actually, last year, went back to the peak of 1939, 8.3 million or something like that. So obviously there's tremendous pressures that I'm sure Guy knows all about, but I think sometimes that is often used to sort of suggest that there isn't enough space for everyone, and it sort of naturalizes somehow the kind of and unfortunately increasing sort of displacement of people, including from this very borough in this area of East London. Yeah, I mean, obviously there are lots of new builds that are often not particularly filled with people, although often filled with lots of investment capital. So I think there is space, and I think I'm an urban geographer, and there's very, very interesting work by social geographers, people like Danny Dorling at Oxford, really arguing actually that, okay, we obviously need to build more houses, but actually just as important is the distribution of who has access to housing as well. So I think there is plenty of room. It's really a question of asking who has access to space in London. I think that's really the important question.
And you actually touched on something. You said there are a lot of houses in London, especially in this area that we're in Shoreditch, especially. But they're all new builds, which are, some of them are actually virtually empty because they're investment properties. So invariably, you're having creative individuals move out of the city, move out of London, move out of the UK. So this is an open question to everybody. Are we still in danger of losing that creative element that makes up London, that unique thing about London, to the gentrification that we're going through? Andrew?
I'll perhaps just kick off. Yes, I mean, I think that is something that's been happening, and it's slightly. I mean, it's obviously a lot of very exciting things been going on in Hackney and East London over the last 20 years, as that film attests. But I mean, at the same time, perhaps some of the kind of cultural dynamism of the city is being, I think, hollowed out a little, actually. And there's a sort of strange tension between the sort of boosterous films that we've just seen, which obviously speak to a kind of reality of what's going on in this part of London, but at the same time, the sort of kind of diversity of the kind of cultural world perhaps arguably isn't what it was in the 1990s and earlier, in terms of the sorts of art that gets made, the sorts of music that gets made. So I think that for me is London's always going to be a very creative place because it's a very rich place, and there's a lot of wealthy people, and there's a lot of wealthy people interested in art and culture. But I think it's really a question of what sort of creativity we want from London. There's a whole range of different types of kind of creative life. It's not only about selling to the market. It's not only about being a certain type of kind of cultural practitioner who is seen as quite a kind of trendy individual who perhaps frequents some of the venues and shops and coffee places that feature in that film. I mean, there's a real sort of kind of vibrant creative ecosystem in London that is really, I mean, it's not under threat. It has been threatened, and it's in reverse in many respects. And I think it's a real challenge. And I'm pleased that Guy mentioned some of these bigger questions actually around housing, around education, around access to space. I think that perhaps are ones that we can talk about now.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Annie?
Yeah, I think what I said about
Your microphone. Sorry. Your microphone.
connecting is the key word, actually, in connecting individuals and communities. And I would go back again to actually recognizing what we have already and feeding that with new creative experiences that are there, that are coming in all the time. I think because somewhere is being gentrified doesn't mean that there isn't creativity taking place. And I think a lot of the creativity that takes place in places like Hackney, Shoreditch, in the city that I come from, Bristol, it's hidden. It's underneath. We all have a creative gene in us, and I think it takes something to trigger that, as it does with flowers, for it to actually flower and come into being. And what we need to do in cities is to create that groundwork to allow the creativity to come out, for people to feel comfortable, for people to feel inspired. And in some ways, when an area gets, it's an odd word, it's gentrified, but changes. And it's about embracing change, because I think we all have to work with change, and change is exciting and it's challenging. And creative change is particularly challenging, but it's there still. And I would just like to mention something which for me, because I work with people and mostly musicians, an experience that I've had of working with a particular musician, a Chinese artist called Guo Yue, who came to this country in the early 80s. So he's been here for 30 years. He came with his brother in his Mao uniform, and he busked in Covent Garden. And from there, he has moved up into playing with orchestras. He plays the flute, he plays with orchestras, he's played with pop groups, he's played with jazz. He was picked up by Peter Gabriel and did a lot of work with him at one time. But he has expanded within London and within the city because of what the city is. And the city has embraced him. And he has now opened a restaurant not very far away from here. He's a fantastic cook. He's done a lot of educational work with me on cross-curricular work in schools. And we had a project called Musical Journeys Untold Stories, which gave him the opportunity to use his music as a catalyst for telling his story. And I know you've had a panel on storytelling and stories. And I think stories are the most important thing to pick up on, actually. I mean, they're quite remarkable. And every one of us has a story to tell. And it's about listening to stories, because out of those stories come extraordinary creative things. So, yeah, one person, one of millions who've come to this country, but who have thrived within London and within the London creative environment.
Okay, thank you so much. Any questions that you want to throw to the panel, please let me know by raising your hand. Councillor Guy, we're looking at creative migration, we're looking at gentrification, and normally when people say that, it almost sounds like a dirty word. So we're not necessarily saying that it is a dirty word or it isn't, but I would like to ask you particularly, how can we, with this gentrification, help the creative migration, keep London the creative city that it needs to be?
Yeah, it's a very interesting sort of dilemma, because it is a challenge. you're being asked to, as a local authority, a council, for example, you're being asked on the one hand to intervene into what in effect is a market created by people. And the reality is, fortunately or unfortunately, I suppose, depending on which way you look at this, a council doesn't have that kind of power. It does not have that kind of authority to intervene into a market. But it can curate a market. It can curate a neighborhood. So it can influence a market. It can start to use a market. Whether you describe a market on the rise as being gentrification, then so be it. But you can use it. It is an economic resource. And if one takes it as an economic asset and then starts to apply local planning policy and then starts to crucially build the collaborations, the social collaborations, the institutional collaborations that can then enhance that curatorial aspect of curating a neighborhood and what it looks like, what it feels like to live in it. One thing I should perhaps just emphasize is that we talk about the great changes of Shoreditch. I've said it, many of us have said it on the panel so far. But the Pitfield estate, the Arden estate, the Hoxton estate, the Haggerston estate, these are communities in their own right, consisting of some 1,000 homes plus in each estate. They were here in 1980. They're still here today. They are communities that are part of all of this. So when we talk about change, for many, the neighborhood has changed, but perhaps not in the way that we might interpret that change. They're seeing something slightly different. They're looking at it through a different prism. Now, it's no less negative, but one way of using this change in the market locally is to create those opportunity hubs, for want of a better way of describing it, where those residents can connect with the new economy, the new job opportunities, and those relationships are built between entrepreneur and resident. And so even if this entrepreneur is not a resident of this community and actually lives somewhere else, but comes here to work, there is a relationship that is built, a positive relationship that is built, where it is far more collaborative and it's far more about exchange of opportunity going on to everybody's advantage. And I must stress, this is not some call for more corporate and social responsibility. One of the most sort of enlightening and exciting propositions that's going on in Hackney's economy, in the creative economy of today, is that those individuals, those entrepreneurs, those innovators, those creative individuals, they don't see this as some kind of sort of social investment that they really should do and it stops people feeling a little guilty. No, no, no. They see it as part of a business plan. They see that if you invest into your neighbor's life, that makes your activities more profitable, not just for them, because they now have a job that they may not have had before, but also for their own business, so their own business grows and prospers. And this is a far, far more coherent way of looking at investment. It sounds quite kind of George Osborne-y, and with all due respect to George Osborne, it is not meant in that way, because it is more thoughtful, this investment. It's not about relying on the market. As I say, it's about curating the market and actually shaping relationships, collaborations, and joint ventures between public and private, between private and third sector. And that's the crucial sort of aspect of dealing with gentrification and ensuring that the creative class, if I could describe that very, very generic group in that way, the creative class still have a place within our economy. I sit on one of my sort of kind of roles on the Mayor of London's Cultural Strategy Group, and time again, our major representatives from our major cultural institutions in the capital, whether they're to do with the museums, whether they're to do with music, the list goes on. Time and time again, there is now a chronic shortage of men and women with the right skills who can afford to be in the capital, to work in these industries, in these sectors, and keep those sectors rolling along. They moved out because they couldn't afford the homes, and now they can't afford the travel. And so we have this great tension, but I do believe it can, the circle can be squared, and that you can bring about a change, but it does require a recognition within the institutional architecture of the capital, from the top, the governance, right the way through to those on the front line in the economy. And then it requires that collaborative effort to actually shape our market so that it can be far more inclusive and far more embracing and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I completely agree, Andrew. There is the space. Yes, it might mean a slight change in lifestyle, but then that's a gradual generational proposition. It becomes more apartment-led, perhaps, than terraced housing-led.
Well, we'll come back to those points, but Andrew, I was going to come back to you. And looking at the creative, should we be looking at the creative class as something that should be protected, that we should be protective more of, and to create more opportunities for young people to get into the creative industry?
Yeah, it really depends how you define who the creative class are. I really have an issue with this term, actually, and it by definition it suggests, because not everyone is necessarily in the creative class normally when it's used, so it's most associated with an American urbanist called Richard Florida, who basically defined it as about 30 to 40% of the workforce in the US. But by definition that means there must be a non-creative class. And I think Annie already mentioned that, obviously there's a bit of kind of creativity, trying to think where my creativity was, but we all have it somewhere. I mean, and I think it can be quite polarizing, actually, this term. It basically means that we very much put certain sorts of individuals on a pedestal as being somehow the kind of entrepreneurial, vibrant, to use some of these words that were in the film. So I have a bit of a problem with this term. And I don't have a problem with the term creativity. I think obviously it's something that is a kind of key feature of our contemporary cities. But I think it's just a question of thinking quite carefully how we go about thinking about it, the words that we use, and how they actually then feed into some of the kind of the policies that are implemented. So I think, actually, to be a bit provocative, there's all sorts of creative classes that perhaps don't feature in a lot of this rhetoric. So, older people who go to church, some of these congregations are very, very creative, but they'll never feature in any of these kind of cultural policy making discussions. Kids in playgrounds, they tend to be kind of stigmatized, but often, they're as creative as anyone. I mean, they're not making a lot of money necessarily, but it's part of their. It's basically creativity is really a fundamental part of people's everyday kind of social worlds. I think that often can be lost in an emphasis really on creativity as only an economic driver and as a sort of way of somehow dealing with kind of de-industrial East London. So I think there could be a lot more, ironically, creativity actually in the way we think about some of these debates. I quite like to talk about gentrification, but maybe we can come back to that later.
Okay, that's fine. But the point that you've actually pulled up is very important, is actually very key, because this idea that there's them, there's us, there's the creative, is in itself, like you said, very polarizing. And so there's almost a looking at the creative industry and those that we term creative as being different and not deemed to be as important. So I think that's also going to that dialogue of the difference between this is the creative class, oh well, it can be shifted around, or people, well, they're just artists, that kind of idea. So my question then back to you, Andrew, is what can we do to actually, one, create a more inclusive ideology around creativity that is not just for the hipsters, as the trend is, but it's actually for everybody, and then making creativity more inclusive into the society as a whole?
Well, that's a tricky question. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to denigrate hipsters or anything. I mean, I think, again, there's a risk it can kind of just switch back and become kind of just as polarizing, and they have a role, and I think perhaps come in for some unfair flack sometimes. I think what I think is really crucial is actually, and I mentioned this earlier, is perhaps thinking a little bit more broadly about how this discussion around unleashing creativity fits in with what's going on in a city like London. And I think just sort of again, I think, redefining some of the terms and perhaps bringing in people that maybe aren't part of conversations normally or aren't sort of deemed to be part of the creative class is a start. But actually, the real challenge is much more broadly in connecting some of these debates into questions about housing. And Guy importantly mentioned that Hoxton is actually, most of Hoxton isn't about Hoxton Square. It isn't about the kind of Shoreditch Triangle. And it's actually, most people there still actually live, reasonably impoverished lives and perhaps haven't seen much of the benefits of the transformations that have undertaken in this area. There's obviously important exceptions, and Guy's mentioned some of the ideas around that. So yeah, it's really these bigger questions, and ultimately, we're a little bit. Local authorities these days, unfortunately, they're forced to curate. Which is an interesting artistic term, which I find fascinating, rather than perhaps manage as they used to. They're kind of left to just kind of steer the market as best they can, so that a little bit of the kind of creative trickle down reaches some of these people that are really in most in need. And so it's these much bigger questions that I think are really important. And I think, again, the creatives, and as are normally defined, have a role here, because they're vibrant, as we've seen. They're often very educated. They're often very articulate. And I think actually what is really crucial is alliances. It's ways of working together. As we've discussed, a lot of creative people in London, apart from the ones that have done very well and probably live in their mansions somewhere in Somerset, but a lot of them, they're disenchanted often. It's quite a struggle to be a kind of creative person in London, particularly a young creative person. You're always moving from job to job. There's real sort of instability in your life. So there's, I think, plenty of scope for perhaps a kind of bigger kind of political movement around kind of creators and their sort of struggles with kind of bigger struggles around things like housing, around employment, around education as well, which is, I think, someone who teaches about creative cities. I kind of feel sometimes kind of complicit, because often now we're charging a lot of money for people, and it's only a certain sort of person that can afford to actually kind of learn about some of the things we're trying to kind of teach. So I think that's also played a kind of big role, I think, in reshaping some of these debates, is about kind of access not only to housing, to space, to livelihoods, but also to kind of knowledge and to education. So I'm sorry I don't have an easy answer for you, Lillian.
That's okay. Thank you so much. The lady on the second row.
Of gentrification actually decreasing the amount of innovation and creativity that we have, because while we still have those communities in Hackney living who were there in the 80s, will they still be there in 20 years' time? We've seen the kind of impact of housing and social policy changes and how that is actually moving people out of the City of London. And I think one of the things that we kind of associate with diversity of people is kind of innovation and creativity. And I just wonder whether we're in danger of actually losing some of that because of the politics, and because maybe we're just even viewing art purely in monetary terms, and what does that kind of bring an area, rather than actually how does it feed our minds and our souls, and actually how we actually behave towards each other.
I think we should start with Annie to answer that question.
Well, I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I think that what we have to do is listen to communities and what communities want. And for me, creativity is about those small gestures of creativity that exist in people's day-to-day lives, that it's really important to keep active and to show that they're valued. And people are doing extraordinary creative things. If you go into a market here in Hoxton or wherever, Shoreditch, the creativity in that market, people selling things, there's theatre, there's the way people arrange their stalls, there's conversations, there's so much going on that is very creative. And I think it's recognizing that kind of day-to-day creativity that we all have, but I think very often policy and politics crushes it. because you're not making shed loads of money, and you're not actually out there and being hip, or whatever expression one wants to use. I think we need to listen to our communities and find out what they want and what helps them and what works for them in terms of allowing that creativity to flourish.
Okay, thank you so much, Annie. And Guy.
Yeah, no, thanks, Lynn. I mean, just to sort of kind of add, I think, to what Annie was just saying, your observation, your comment is well made. I think a creative community relies on this continual supply of new talent and new ideas coming in. Now, there is obviously part of that community that will be generating new ideas. They may be well-rooted, well-established in that community. But actually, that does lead towards a corporatization, perhaps, of a neighborhood. In other words, that perhaps very creative thread that must run through a successful creative economy starts to sort of kind of fray a little, and it starts to unravel. And we start to lose the very energy, the innovation, the ideas, the new ideas. Whether they succeed or fail, it's about this continual supply of new ideas, new ways of looking at the world, new ways of interacting with the world, whatever the creative discipline it is that individuals may be involved in. And so from a public policy perspective, certainly one has sort of kind of, I suppose, sort of kind of tried to use public policy in a way in which, as new corporate investment comes forward, with it comes forward the provision of space that is accessible, that is affordable to that next generation of creative talent to come forward and become part of that same community. So in other words, you're not displacing or expelling. What you're actually physically doing is intervening into a market to actually bring forward that space. Now, interestingly, when those forms of policy-led collaborations actually realize on the ground, what starts to happen is that those who are making the investment into a new building, for example, suddenly realize that if on the ground floor you've got space for many tens, if not 100 plus, of startup, affordable space where people can be experimenting with new ideas, they have an opportunity to come into the community, very quickly you realize, as a developer, as an investor, that some of those ideas then succeed. And those individuals move upstairs into a slightly bigger space and start paying a more of a market-led rent. And some of those individuals then go on to succeed still further and move up onto the upper floors where they need more space and pay a full market rent. Now, when you look at it into that context and you actively promote that form of business planning within the commercial sector, within the development sector, then you can start to see some very tangible results come forward. Suddenly what you start to see is you realize that it acts as the catalyst to realize spaces where new talent can always be part of this ever-evolving and changing community and not get displaced by it. And that's a very, very important aspect of public policy and a practical response to some of the challenges I think you were raising.
Okay. Andrew, how would you address her point?
Yeah, so maybe, I think with this term gentrification, which, so I teach at UCL, and the term actually was first devised by a sociologist called Ruth Glass at UCL in 1964, and I'm always curious about how it gets used in these sorts of discussions, because I think what Ruth Glass meant was, it's not a nice process, gentrification. It was, very much bound up with the kind of British class system, hence the use of gentry. And it was very much meant to be a dirty word. And I think I do get a little bit worried when it's kind of used as a sort of, as analogous just to kind of urban change. It's just kind of what happens. Because ultimately, gentrification is driven by the choices of people involved in the property market, involved in the kind of political kind of way cities are set up. And I think if we think about gentrification in relation to some of the shifts that have gone on in a place like Hoxton, Hoxton has undergone absolutely dramatic gentrification since the early 1990s. And that has had winners and losers, and I think we need to sort of do an assessment of who's benefited from this. In some ways, the initial winners were kind of the artists that often were there in the early 1990s, but actually a lot of them actually ended up losing out because, apart from the few that became property developers actually, or managed to buy where they were living because they ultimately were priced out. And again, it's interesting to see in your film, Guy, that it features the white cube, which hasn't been there for like the last 4 years. I don't know when that film was made. So that sort of whole sort of art scene is long gone in many respects. I mean, that the kind of perhaps the sort of reputation lingers and is kind of nurtured in interesting ways by various kind of property interests. But again, it's about actually, even if there isn't the displacement, and I mean ultimately gentrification is about people being pushed out of a place. Even if there isn't that sort of direct displacement, ultimately it is kind of indirect because people who maybe have, well, it's changing, some sort of security of tenancy in social housing in Hoxton, perhaps don't feel like they belong to the area anymore. I mean, the area, certainly if you go up Hoxton Street, is changed in the last 5 years, and you've got a whole host of different sorts of shops and amenities, and perhaps it just doesn't have the same sort of feel. And ultimately, and if they have children who want to sort of stay in the area, there's often, again, unless they've struck it lucky somehow. Because again, this is one more point, which is, I mean, I think also this element on this sort of access to some of these new sorts of creative jobs is also one that, again, and there's lots of brilliant schemes, and I don't pretend to be an expert on all of them, but I think often what we're finding in London these days is that if you want to go into a kind of creative profession, you basically need to come from a wealthy family or know the right people. And that perhaps that wasn't the case 30, 40 years ago. I mean, it's always been the case in some respects, but in terms of, sort of getting internships, in terms of, sort of having the kind of right sort of way of kind of going about finding a job and knowing what to do, you have to come from certain sort of backgrounds and know certain ways of operating. So I think that's my other concern, is that, again, just because the city seems to have some sort of kind of vitality in terms of the kind of sort of creative jobs that are being produced, that doesn't necessarily mean somehow everyone can easily access them. But I'm sure this has been part of the discussion this week already.
Isn't it about changing values too? When a place gets gentrified, it's the advantaged classes, groups that come in, and the values of that community then change very dramatically sometimes over a long period of time, but actually probably here in Hackney and Shoreditch, it's been quite speedy. Would you say?
Well, look, I moved into Hackney in about 1987. And I'm sure, and I would sort of be happy to sort of acquiesce to the kind of accusation that, well, there you go. Here I am, the only one wearing a tie with a suit, and is this gentrification personified or what? But you're right, Annie. Yeah, it has sort of changed in a way in which, yes, without doubt, there is a far more articulate community. It is not necessarily any less motivated. It's
but
just
a community that argues for what it wants.
Exactly.
As a voice.
And what has been interesting to watch is that at the beginning of the 80s, I was an art student, and it was at the time when Hoxton was fundamentally a community of artists because no one else wanted to be here. So the buildings were falling apart. Nobody wanted to rent the buildings, and you boiled in summer, you froze in winter, but you had space. And out of that came the Brit Art movement over the course of the 80s and into the 90s. And that was a generation of artists who quite literally sort of brought forward a major movement that was led by British art that went global in that regard, and also started to sort of set in motion what's gone and happened today, which is the boundaries between different forms of creative expression and production and manufacture started to get blurred and started to be removed. And so it's been an interesting journey in that regard. What does seem to have also come about, though, and I must say this, is that where we're at today, Hackney as a council delivers the second largest number of affordable homes each year than any other place in England. And it's doing that year on year on year. That's very important because what it does do is it starts to anchor communities into neighbourhoods. People become less transient when those opportunities are there. It is also investing hundreds of millions of pounds over a 3-year cycle into improving the condition of affordable homes in the borough that are already built. And by that, what I mean, I'm talking about roofs and central heating and kitchens and bathrooms.
Right.
This is very important interventions, because where it starts to lead towards is that each year, Hackney Council, like all councils, conducts a resident survey. And what's come back this year is that 90% of the residents of Hackney feel that everybody in Hackney gets along extremely well. That is not a figure that is reflected in other East London boroughs. Far from it, indeed. Now, that is a very, very interesting testament to the work that everybody has done. I include a council in this, but I also include a very, very broad range of other groups, which do include the churches group, for example.
Right. Guy, we will come back to that point, but we still have one more question from the audience.
Thank you for answering my question. Really kind of interesting views. And I just have to say I really kind of agree with the panel's comments on gentrification actually and what that actually means in reality, because I think it can just sound really nice, but actually we forget about some of the negative impacts of that. I was also really interested in your comments around the role of the corporate sector in actually playing a role in, you know, leading the kind of arts. And I just wondered whether you thought that, and not that I don't think they don't have a role to play, because they do, but actually should they be leading this because they are the ones who've got the money?
I think, Annie, would you like to take that?
Well, I think, yes, they have a role to play, obviously. This is not my area of expertise at all. But I think everyone has a role to play. Everyone, the important thing is that we give people a voice and that those councils are listening. And I think that's a really interesting point you made, Guy, about the fact that 90% of people living in Hackney are happy living in Hackney. That's a fantastic testament to what's gone on in this borough. And, you know, I don't know what happens in other boroughs in London, but people need a voice. People need to be listened to. And it sounds like Hackney Council has been listening, and that's really important. And I would take this much wider to say that, you know, wherever we are, whether we're in Bristol or we're in Edinburgh or Liverpool, it doesn't matter. That the same principles stand, that we need to listen to what people need. We need to understand what the motivations are for people to be creative. This panel was talking about creative migration, and I think we haven't really touched on that very much, actually. I think it really is about people coming into not just this country, but coming in and enriching the country in all sorts of different ways. And that may be as a corporate creative, it may be as a single artist, it may be as a musician, it may be as someone working in a shop. It doesn't kind of matter really, but it's about how do we keep that flow? How do we keep diversity? Because I think, in a sense, I mean, Hackney is a very diverse borough and has become one over the years. Bristol is a very diverse city, and I think we are a hugely enriched city by that diversity. And I would argue for diversity yes, on every level.
Okay, thank you so much, Annie. So basically, we're almost out of time, but with just very quick points. How do we keep the flow of creativity in the city? How do we maintain that, and how do we grow it? I think, Andrew.
So when you mean flow of creativity, you talking about people, money, ideas?
People and ideas. How do we keep that flow going in and out in the terms of creative migration?
Okay, well, I mean, don't think London really has a problem in terms of the kind of people moving in and out. I mean, as guys mentioned, I mean, that's kind of part of its kind of raison d'etre is the kind of it's ever changing. There's always kind of people, attracted to come here for whatever reason. I mean, I think in terms of this kind of migration theme, I mean, I think again, it's a bit about sort of perhaps when I read that on the blurb, I was thinking migration. I didn't realise that was just only about creators. I was thinking about bigger questions that we have, particularly in Europe, over migration today, and how that kind of feeds into this debate. So again, I think that's just to repeat. I think that's really my emphasis is that a lot of these debates, I think, they're very interesting, can get a little bit myopic if they only focus on the sort of slightly self-enclosed world of just the kind of the creative professional. And we need to think about how that kind of connects into wider questions about how London is changing and how we sort of want our London to be. Okay, obviously London is going, is a kind of cultural hub, in part because of the kind of wealth and kind of corporates that are involved and do act as a sort of patron in many different ways, and I don't want to begrudge them for doing that. That's great, but it's just a question of making sure that there is this space, both physically but also in terms of the kind of social, political space of London as well for people to kind of do what they want to do.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to thank our entire panel for being here and answering our question on creative migration. Thank you so much.